Yo, yo, animators! What is up? I'm pretty pumped. But it's going to be, that extra week before we meet together for session 3 on the way of Jesus with Mark Scandrett. Because this Wednesday is the post-election Eucharist. I hope you're all going to be there because George and I spent a whole lot of time putting it together. So, come, and then us animators and their significant others, Tony, we're going to go over to Select Beer and hang out and chat a little bit. And, yeah. All right. So, homework assignment. The experiment in truth this week is really built off a lot of the conversation we had about spirituality. You kind of all started talking about how it felt to write prayers and then think through how you pick words to then capture this experience. And one of the dynamics, this kind of dialectic that came up in the conversation, Karen mentioned that there's this relationship between God talk and heart speak. And that we were all kind of had these experiences. There's kind of unanimating God talk, and then there's also these kind of experiences we have with the divine or the sacred and stuff like that then we don't really know where the words are for it, and that part of the gift of a church family, and that you and your close loved ones and such participating in a church is that you start to make those kind of connections together of the God talk and the heart speak. And that kind of conversation I thought was really awesome because in it we found out that out of this kind of lesson 1, right, where we talked about God into this discussion about spirituality, we found that for many people there, one of the reasons they're in the community they're in is because they really wanted their family to share the same religious and spiritual rhythm. And I think that really resonated a lot with what not just a number of us said, but what Danielle was talking about, or Lily and Danielle was talking about in the video, where she said that religious traditions and the Christian tradition isn't just us picking flowers that die, but really like hanging out in a garden and growing and taking root and blooming and using the resources from our past, from our texts, from our heroes of the faith, from the saints and the faithful and those that we know in our own life that have helped us, and that the idea, right, that this gift religious community and religious tradition can give is something we couldn't share in our homes was problematic. And so I think there's a sense in which our desires for our homes to have this shared spiritual rhythm points us to this kind of need for us as human beings to have a community in order to dig deeper, both in our kind of spiritual quest and connection with God, but also a community to really live that out. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week as we look at the way of Jesus. Because people on Team Jesus in the Christian church, when we figure out what is it like to dig deep in what is our well that we dig down deep and keep packing tons of buckets full of spiritual water, well, it's a story about this rabbi. His name is Jesus, and we are going to be reflecting on that and how that can be the place that we as a community and our families and our church and the larger church kind of returns to refresh, to renew, to revision, to kind of change the way we see, think, act, and feel and experience the world, to touch base with this image of the invisible God we have in the story of Jesus. And I say that because I think it could help a number of the lingering questions, and it might, as we get ready for next week, to kind of put a number of the questions that we left on the table. And I think they were great to leave them there so that we don't answer them but have to sit with them. But a number of us asked the question, I'm trying to figure out who I am, my own identity before God on my own. And some kind of talked about how they have this identity they have in their family or in the church or whatever, but they haven't really figured out a way to own their own identity before God. Others said, I kind of have this relationship with God. I know of myself as loved, and yet I don't really know where I'm going. I don't know what that next step or what God's calling me to looks like, and really how to process it. So where am I going? And then others shared this frustration of kind of a stagnation, like what were we doing? What are What does faithfulness look like? What is it in the Christian faith that can kind of, I don't know, kind of crack through the crust of the kind of stale life, this lack of a depth, dimension that I'm experiencing, and I think all these questions about our spiritual lives and how we understand God and what is it like to experience and relate to God daily in our lives and have God kind of call more beautiful things out of us. Really, as Christians, we need to go back, right, to that story of Jesus. And so that's what we're going to be talking about next. And I'm hoping that in preparation, that our experiment in truth would be to look at these two famous sermons that Jesus gave his disciples. The first one is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 to 7, and then the Sermon on the Plain, which is in the Gospel of Luke, is chapter 6. And there's a lot of the same material. It's slightly different, but here is Jesus' sermon to his disciples. So this is kind of like a summary, a thesis statement of life in the way of Jesus. And I would love for you to read them each a couple times and say, and reflect on it and come back with some insights. How does this offer of way of living in the world, following Jesus, answer those questions? Who am I? Where am I going? And what are we, people in this tradition, people that are following Jesus today, what are we supposed to be doing? And as you do, you can think about how Jesus even frames the sermon. He begins them by saying, in some way, you are blessed. He just announces it, right? Blessed are. And he just starts throwing out blessings. And you don't have to do anything, but you do have to awaken to the fact that you are blessed. You do have to receive it. And then he says, you are called, right? You are the light upon a hill, the salt of the earth, us, we, y'all, second person plural. Jesus was Southerner. Y'all are called to do these things. And then he says, as y'all are being you, you will pray and fast and give, but here's how you do it. And I find it completely amazing how Jesus just assumes, right, that his disciples are going to do these things, but then he kind of insists on them being done in a very specific way, or actually taking a lot of the religiosity out of these spiritual practices. So look at it and pay attention to those. And then he kind of ends all those with, look, I'm saying a lot of crazy stuff here. You know, Jesus is like, woe to you who are rich, and blessed are the poor, and those kind of things that we all kind of get uncomfortable, right? And he says, trust this way which will lead to life. It's narrow, it costs you everything, but it gives you much more. And don't walk down that way that leads to destruction. It's broad. And then he ends with that story, right, of there's a man who built a house on sand, one that built it on rock, the one on rock stands. So trust these words I give to you. So as we prepare for our next meeting, read these two sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, and try to hear the text invite us into our next step of faithfulness in the way of Jesus. What does he say that makes you uncomfortable? What does it say that pushes some buttons? What words did he speak or good news you hadn't heard in a while? What is it that evokes excitement in you? Where does God Talk and Heart Speak interact in this moment? How could this vision of kingdom faithfulness, of a community of disciples giving themselves to this radical way that Jesus gave us, how can that impact us where we are? And how can we as a group encourage one another, challenge one another, and support one another, and call each other into greater faithfulness? When we get together, we're going to hear about Mark, who, of course, kicked off our Animate series, and about his own desire to let this call, this way of Jesus, impact his own living, and what that looks like. So I hope that in preparation we spend a little bit of time with those texts of Jesus talking to his disciples, and with those questions that we have been asking each other. Don't forget, Election Eucharist. Wednesday night. I'm so pumped about this group, and I'm really enjoying it.